Thank you for joining me today to discuss the myth of Joseph Smith's alleged plural wife, Agnes Moulton Coolbrith. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the few people who have donated to the channel, including Mark, Henry, Travis, and the Jacked Mormon Show, whose nifty Starbase Kolob merch you can purchase at the link in the description. As usual for these Myth of videos, we'll be using Brian Hale's website as the basis, because he did such a nice job in gathering the sources. Unfortunately for him, it's with the energy of a student trying to dazzle the professor with the written report while desperately hoping that she won't check the citations. Agnes was married to Don Carlos Smith, Joseph's younger brother. They lived in Nauvoo until Don Carlos died in August 1841, under suspicious circumstances that allowed John Taylor to take over the Times and Seasons newspaper. We read from Hales that after Don Carlos's death, 5 months later, Joseph Smith was sealed to Agnes. Sounds very confident, but how does he know? Hales tells us that Brigham Young's journal for January 6, 1842 records, "I was taken into the lodge, J. Smith was Agnes." The word "was" probably stands for wed and sealed. Well, that certainly sounds convincing, doesn't it? Let's just pull up Brigham Young's journal and have a look for ourselves. Oh dear. There are several problems with this journal entry, and believe it or not, the cipher it's written in is the least of them. It's a simple geometric substitution cipher, based on the Royal Arch Masonic cipher. It was cracked 30-something years ago by Arturo de Hoyos. But when you apply the cipher key, you do not get what Hales said. You get, "I was taken into Ptgelpdj" for the first entry, and "J. Smith was Agnes" for the second. It's generally assumed that this is due to errors that Brigham made in writing the cipher, the error in the first entry consisting of missing dots, and those in the second entry consisting of inverted triangles. If those mistakes are corrected, then it does say, "I was taken into the lodge" in the first entry, and "J. Smith was Agnes" in the second. But the monogamy denier still must assume that "was" is an acronym for wedded and sealed, and that the Agnes, or Agnes S, referred to is Agnes Smith. To do that, they also have to assume that Brigham didn't make any additional mistakes when writing the cipher. But as I said, the cipher is the least of the problems with this. In the third entry on the page, Young claims that he was, quote, "with my wife, alone by my fireside, for the first time in years." Very picturesque. But on 18 January 1842, Brigham Young had been home from his mission to England for about 5 months. While not impossible that he was never alone with his wife by the fire in the past 5 months, after having been away for years, it's unlikely. But, like Brigham by the fireside, we're just getting warmed up. In the first coded entry, dated January 6, 1842, Brigham says that he entered into the lodge. But the records of the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge apparently show Young's petition to enter the lodge not being approved until April 1842, when he also was initiated into the first degree of Masonry. The Nauvoo Freemasons did indeed meet on 6 January 1842, but there is no mention of Brigham Young on that date in the detailed minute book. It seems clear that these journal entries were written after the given dates. How long after? We don't know. The previous entry was from 1840, and the next entry, after several blank pages, is August 1844, after Joseph is dead. In other words, there is no way to tell how long after April 1842 Brigham Young manufactured these journal entries, but manufacture them later he certainly did. Now, there is the possibility that even though Brigham recorded the entry in a strange cipher on the wrong date months or even years later with discrepancies in the accompanying entries, it's possible some kind of marriage ceremony involving Joseph Smith and Agnes Coolbrith did happen. But remember, J. Smith wedded and sealed Agnes S. does not necessarily mean that Joseph was married to Agnes. Joseph could have been the officiator. Possibly he wedded and sealed Agnes to her deceased husband Don Carlos, perhaps even with Joseph acting as proxy for his brother. This is consistent with other records from April 1844, when Hiram told the church that Joseph wedded and sealed Hiram and his deceased wife Jerusha, with his living wife Mary acting as proxy. As I've covered in other videos, Hiram also made it clear that this was not polygamy or anything like it, but that other people were using it to perpetuate their secret polygamy cult. It is quite possible that, if Joseph wedded and sealed Agnes to his dead brother Don Carlos, it was also misinterpreted as polygamy, either accidentally or intentionally. You might say that this is hypothesizing on my part, and that's true, but it's a hypothesis with contemporary historical support, unlike the myth that Agnes Coolbrith was a plural wife of Joseph Smith. The next piece of evidence for the myth is from later in 1842. John Bennett published his lurid historical fiction, History of the Saints, listing Mrs. A.S. as one of Joseph Smith's alleged wives. But accepting this as evidence creates problems. First, one has to assume that A.S. is Agnes Smith. But even if we assume that, how could Bennett have known about this marriage, so secret that there are no records at all except a cipher in Brigham Young's journal? Bennett claims that the marriage was performed by Brigham Young. Some might claim that Young told him. But not only did Young not say that, Bennett doesn't say it either. In fact, although Bennett himself calls the marriage ceremonies private, he doesn't say how he knows about them. It makes one wonder. Apparently, the patina of 180 years is enough to turn no evidence into evidence, at least when historians want Joseph Smith to have been a polygamist. In any case, that's all the historical record has to offer for almost 30 years. In the meantime, Agnes remarried and left the LDS Church, relocating to California after living briefly in Utah. In August 1871, an anonymous letter was published in a Utah newspaper under the name Argus, part of a series of letters criticizing the church and Brigham Young in particular. Argus reported that almost 30 years earlier, Agnes had told him and his wife that Joseph had propositioned Agnes to have sexual relations with him, to have a son so that Don Carlos's name should not be lost in Israel, a reference to levirate marriage in the Old Testament. Not only is this an old recollection of someone who clearly has a grudge against the LDS Church, in Argus's version of events, Agnes rebuffs Joseph, which is a blatant contradiction with the official LDS narrative. Of course, Brian Hales and the other monogamy deniers never shy from using a contradictory source that will advance their narrative. It was later revealed that Argus was a disaffected Mormon named Charles Wandell, who lied in his letters about the Mountain Meadows massacre, giving alleged details that he could not have known. That's enough to discredit him as a source on Mountain Meadows for the folks at Fair LDS. But if he would lie about a recent event to damage the church, why would he not lie about an event 30 years ago to do so? Next is an 1844 letter from Lucy Kimball, another alleged wife of Joseph, to Joseph Fielding Smith Sr. Lucy had been touring California and visited with Agnes Coolbrith, born Josephina Smith, the daughter of Don Carlos and Agnes. Lucy, the staunch polygamist, claims to report what Ina, the imaginative poet, asserts that her mother told Joseph Smith's sons about polygamy when they came to California in 1876. Since Agnes died 26 December 1876, this third-hand account is over 7 years after events. Brian Hales weaves his narrative with such perfect sophistry that it wasn't until my third or fourth time reading the letter that I realized that although this is presented as evidence of Agnes being married to Joseph, that is not what the letter says. It says that Agnes bore testimony to the boys that those women in Salt Lake were their father's wives, not Agnes. This is another case of the monogamy deniers using any sources to create their narrative of Joseph Smith's polygamy, even if the sources don't support the narrative. In fact, if anything, this seems to provide evidence against Agnes having been Joseph's wife, because wouldn't her personal story have been a better counter to her nephew's claims? And how would she know that these other women were Joseph's wives? In any case, what this third-hand account of Agnes's words does not say could reveal far more than what it does. The next big set piece is Mary West's deposition during the Temple Lot court case in 1892. This happened when Mary was 77 years old, about 50 years after the alleged events. Her testimony is, to put it politely, a jumbled mess. She claims that she was living in Agnes' house in 1843, which conveniently gave her a front row seat to witness everything the church needed her to have seen, although later she says that she didn't know if Joseph ever stayed there with Agnes, and that she just stopped at Agnes' house. In addition to claiming that Agnes told her that she was Joseph's wife, Mary testified that Joseph personally told her about the polygamy revelation the first time he saw her, and that Hiram came over to chat with her about polygamy. Mary claimed that Hiram told her that Emma had come over to polygamy, and had asked Hiram to marry other women to Joseph. In perhaps the most unlikely series of events to ever strain credulity, Mary reports that Hiram came to tell them about Joseph's freshly written polygamy revelation, and when Mary asked to read it, Hiram left to get it, only to return a little while later to say that, gosh darn it, Emma had just taken it out of Joseph's pocket and burned it. Aside from the suspiciously convenient timing, wasn't polygamy supposed to be secret? The monogamy deniers want to have it both ways, that polygamy in Nauvoo was so secret there are no written records, and Hiram and Joseph had to publicly deny it to throw people off the scent, but also that Hiram and Joseph were chatting about it with their sister-in-law's roommate, and offering to show secret revelations at the drop of a hat. Hales offers a couple of other pieces of evidence to pad out the sources. One is the Relief Society minutes for 28 September 1842. The reference Hales gives is from an expensive 74 DVD resource set, something that not many people will be able to check. But it's also available in multiple places online, where you can see that the minutes do not mention Agnes, and apparently have no connection to this at all. The other is the alleged list of Joseph's alleged wives, allegedly scribbled by Oliver Olney on the back of another document. I dealt with that fiction in my Myth of Louisa Beeman video. What are we left with to support the idea that Agnes Coolbrith was a plural wife of Joseph Smith? There are no statements from Joseph or Agnes. The only statement definitely given during Joseph's life is from the known liar and Joseph's bitter enemy, John Bennett. And he does not mention Agnes by name. That has to be inferred. Brigham Young's coded, misdated, manufactured journal entry, which you also have to infer refers to Agnes and marriage, might have been made during Joseph's life, but that's impossible to determine. At the very least, we know that it wasn't written when Brigham indicated it was, which calls the entire thing into question. There's the letter from the known liar, Charles Wandell, aka Argus, which contradicts the narrative by saying that no union actually took place. There's the third-hand account where Agnes allegedly says that other women were married to Joseph, but does not mention herself being married to him. Then, 50 years after the alleged event, when the church is desperate to prove in court that Joseph was a polygamist, Mary West claims to have seen and heard everything the church needed, even though she contradicted the prevailing myths of Nauvoo secrecy, and, at times, herself. So in the end we have nothing at all. The myth of Agnes Coolbrith, like the myth behind each of Joseph's alleged wives that I've reviewed, is built on suspicion, lies, and contradictions, but above all, on the monogamy denier's deep need for Joseph Smith to have been a polygamist. A critical review of the sources gives us little reason to doubt Joseph's claims that Emma Smith was his only wife, and I believe Joseph.